Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historic insights. And I figured that since last week's episode was about the history of American soda and soft drinks, now would be a good time to discuss the history of alcohol in this country. Because it appears as if American alcohol goes back to around the time of America itself. So please join me and pour yourself a cold one or a hard one, those of you who drink, of course, as I dive into the history of American alcoholic drinks. First and foremost, fermented beverages are very, very old. Up to 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, according to prehistoric archaeologists. How did it happen? Who knows? Perhaps some ancient Mesopotamian man found a jar of honey that had been sitting out for the sun too long, or perhaps some horses or other livestock happened to eat some apples that had gone bad and ended up acting rather strange. It's anybody's guess. But that, as they say, is ancient history, and now we will go into some more recent history. In Europe during the 1600s, water was considered to be less sanitary than fermented beverages like wine and beer. You don't have to look at the history of the time to understand why. Cholera was a major problem because human waste was affecting the water supply. And it's easy to understand why in large cities, especially in London, when the water table is relatively low and the sewer is also very deep in the ground. You can imagine that when the human waste seeps into the water supply, a lot of people were getting sick. But I don't mean to disgust anyone. Public sources of water are often contaminated, as I stated before, but the processes involved with producing alcohol made it safe to drink. And when the Puritan settlers came from England to the New World during the early 1600s, they brought an abundant supply of beer. In fact, the amount of beer on the Mayflower surpassed the supply of water. And alcohol was freely available to people of all ages during colonial time. It wasn't uncommon for men, women, and children to have beer or ale with every meal. Could you imagine like some 10-year-old getting sloshed at breakfast? And being thousands and thousands of miles away from home, early colonists had to learn how to make beer, cider, and wine from the supplies that grew naturally in the New World, such as evergreen branches, fruit, and berries. And hop seeds were imported from England so the settlers could also make beer in the traditional way. Colonists also fermented peach juice and apple cider and imported rum from the West Indies. And in the colony of Virginia, barbecues, market days, and elections were a chance to pass around kegs and kegs and kegs of liquor. And in 1770, many Americans opened the day with a drink and consumed rum or hard cider with every meal. And people of all ages drank, even toddlers. I know it's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine someone getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to start the full day of work out on the fields, and also tilting back a mug of hard apple cider or something like that, and then going to work. I wonder how often it was for public or workplace intoxication during those days. And I hate to imagine some drunken toddlers or something. Now, Josiah, you better start acting goofy and stop vomiting and go work out in the fields. Do what I said. No, put the mug apple cider down and get to the work. I don't know what the Puritans actually sounded like, but for some reason, an old, New England fisherman fit the bill. And in the mid America from the Caribbean, and this distilled beverage quickly became popular throughout the colonies. Needless to say, early Americans believed that alcohol was a gift to human society. However, drunkenness was a sin and an indication of moral weakness. The early Americans believed that anyone who drank too much could simply sober up by exercising enough willpower, which, as anyone who has probably had a few in his life can tell you, is completely false. I cannot speak from personal experience, though I don't drink. Benjamin Rush, a physician who practiced in Philadelphia in the late 1700s, was one of the first Americans to propose that alcohol addiction is not a matter of will, but a disease that can only be treated by avoiding alcohol altogether. And his theory was not widely accepted by his peers, but his ideas about alcoholism would have a strong influence on the American temperance movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. But needless to say, people have lined up to drink since the early days of this country. However, after the Revolutionary War, and to give you an idea of how petty the British could be, Brits refused to supply the former colonies with rum. However, Kentucky and Ohio had a glut of corn that could be transformed into whiskey, and farmers produced such large volumes that whiskey ended up being cheaper than beer, coffee, or milk. And given contamination in many water supplies, it was also safer than water. And by 1830, U.S. residents over the age of 15 drank more than 7 gallons of alcohol a year. I don't know what the current statistic is, but I can only assume it's much less. And to go back in time for a minute, a 1660 map of New Amsterdam, which was what New York was called, it was originally a Dutch colony, detailed 26 breweries and taverns, a clear indication that producing and selling beer were popular and profitable trades in the American colonies. And despite the early popularity of beer, as I said before, other alcoholic beverages steadily grew in importance, and by the early 18th century, several of them had eclipsed beer commercially. And back to beer for a moment. National production statistics are unavailable before 1810, which reflects the rather limited importance of the early brewing industry, and in 1810, America's 140 commercial breweries collectively produced over just 180,000 barrels of beer, and during the next 50 years, total beer output continued to increase, but production remained small-scale and local. However, this is not to suggest that brewing could not be profitable. And in 1797, James Vassar founded a brewery in Poughkeepsie, New York, whose success echoed far beyond the brewing industry. And after several booming years, Vassar ceded control of the brewery to his sons Matthew and John. And following the death of his brother in an accident and a fire that destroyed the plant, Matthew Vassar rebuilt the brewery in 1811. And demand for his beer grew rapidly, and by the early 1840s, the Vassar Brewery produced nearly 15,000 barrels of ale and porter annually, a significant amount for this period. And continued investment in the firm facilitated even greater production levels, and by 1860, its employees turned out 30,000 barrels of beer, placing it among the nation's largest breweries. Today, the Vassar name is better known for the college Matthew Vassar, endowed in 1860 with rentings from his brewery. That's right, Vassar College has beer to thank for being founded. And with such a big rise in the consumption of alcohol, of course, there would be some people who would try to stomp it out. And as I said before, alcohol was an integral part of American culture from the first time that colonies were established. However, the growing popularity of rum, whiskey, and other distilled spirits caused a reaction against the effects of excessive alcohol consumption. And a public rush for temperance, a limitation of alcohol consumption, or total abstinence from alcohol, which I observed, began as early as 1789 with the first American Temperance Society being founded in Connecticut, and additional societies were soon formed in other parts of the country, including the American Temperance Society, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Anti-Saloon League. And women who had been abused or whose children had been neglected by alcoholic husbands were strong sponsors for these temperance groups, which based many of their beliefs about moderation and abstinence on the theories of Dr. Benjamin Rush. Rather than being a gift from God and a healing substance, alcohol was viewed as a source of crime, violence, and poverty. And this now brings us to a discussion of whiskey. The first American commercial distillery was opened in America in 1783 in Louisville, Kentucky. And in 1791 through 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion begins between grain farmers and the U.S. government. In 1798, George Washington started producing whiskey at his Mount Vernon distillery, and in fact, the distillery still makes whiskey to this day, which now takes us to the temperance movement. Massachusetts became the first state to ban the sale of liquor except in bulk, though the law was easily circumvented. One enterprising seller sold the rights to see his blind pig for 6 cents, and the purchaser also got a free drink. And the Massachusetts law and similar state prohibition statutes were deemed ineffective and quickly abandoned. But the temperance movement remained socially powerful, and by 1850, half the population had stopped drinking entirely. And the first state to outright ban alcohol entirely was Maine in 1851. Maine's dry law, which fueled the temperance movement that eventually led to national prohibition in 1919, however, could not stop the state's citizens from making or using alcohol. Alcohol was still manufactured by farmers who made their own wine and cider from their crops, and I can imagine they also probably made whiskey from corn they grew, if they had distilleries and knew how to make distilleries. And these illegal beverages were sold in kitchen bars, while grocery stores and drug stores sold alcoholic products for medicinal purposes or as food additives. The temperance movement also gained traction during the early 20th century, and in 1910, New York State passed the first law against driving while intoxicated, and 10 years later, the United States government mandated the ban of alcohol manufacturing, sales, and consumption with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. And the era of national prohibition officially began. Now, why is a story all in and of itself? It was partly thanks to World War I. German-American brewers lost their political clout as public sentiment turned against all things German. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, Frankfurters became Liberty sausages, and Dachshunds became known as Liberty Hounds. An anti-liquor activist warned that breweries were using grain that was needed for the war effort, and Congress passed a wartime dry law which soon was superseded by the aforementioned 18th Amendment. And the Volstead Act, or the National Prohibition Act, established the rules supporting the 18th Amendment. In the early days of Prohibition, these sweeping changes seemed to have a positive effect on American society. The U.S. National Archives noted that the consumption of alcohol was reduced by 30% initially and the consumption of hard liquor by 50%. But as time went on, the illegal production of alcohol, or bootlegging as it was called, increased. And bootleg alcohol was sold at underground establishments called speakeasies. And by 1925, historians estimate that there were as many 1,000 speakeasies in New York City alone. The laws of Prohibition were difficult to enforce, and the black market for liquor fed the growth of organized crime. And the effort to ban alcohol through the United States ultimately failed. Americans in urban areas objected to the fact that a movement sponsored primarily by rural politicians had such a far-reaching effect on every segment of society. Meanwhile, as the economy faltered and unemployment rose in the 1920s and early 30s, the U.S. government became aware of the impact of Prohibition on state and federal tax income. And in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt passed the Cullen-Harrison Act, an amendment to the Volstead Act, allowing the production of wine and beer with low alcohol content. And in December of that year, the 18th Amendment was rendered null and void entirely, and because the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment of the Constitution, so Prohibition came to an end. Interestingly, the history of recovery programs is the history of alcohol in America. During the early 19th century, a religious organization called the Oxford Group was established to promote values like self-improvement, moderation, and outreach to others. Many of the practices of this group, such as taking self-inventory and making amends to others, would later be integrated into the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA for short. After a man named Roland Holland visited the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung for help with his alcohol addiction, Roland was referred to the Oxford Group as a source for spiritual guidance. Roland and Ebby Thatcher, sounded Swedish, Ebby Thatcher, a fellow alcoholic, were able to stop drinking by practicing the principles of the Oxford Group. Ebby later introduced these principles to a man named Bill Wilson, one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Once a successful stockbroker, Wilson hit rock bottom with alcoholism at the age of 39. After multiple failures at drying out, he had a spiritual awakening in 1934 when undergoing treatment for chronic alcoholism at Towns Hospital in Manhattan. As a result of his awakening and his subsequent sobriety, the spiritual component of AA became one of the group's most powerful recovery tools. And in 1934, he shared his experiences with Robert Smith. I know, one of the widest names you probably ever heard. A physician who was struggling with alcohol addiction. Bob Smith, or Dr. Bob, became one of the founding members of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was officially formed in 1935. In that same year, the American Medical Association recognized alcoholism as a disabling physical condition requiring medical treatment. And since the 1930s, the principles of AA have been implemented in addiction recovery programs throughout the country. Membership to this anonymous organization is free of charge, but voluntary service to the organization and outreach to other alcoholics are expected as part of the recovery process. And with that, I have to bring this podcast to a close. And what have we learned today? Well, we've learned that there is help for everyone who wants it and for those who need it. And that sometimes laws might not always go as originally intended. And I would like to thank the fine people at accessresidentialtreatment.com, rackhousewhiskeyclub.com, eh.net, ncbi.ih.gov, and daily.jstore.org for the information I used to make this podcast. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless.